Now, I'm going to apologise before this video even begins. Before I even start the slides and start the video properly, I'm going to say now, be prepared for some bad Japanese. I am going to pronouncing it badly. It's got great spirit, it's got great energy, it's got a great enthusiasm. It's not always the best incorrect. I do try and correct myself, and I try and show it. But the thing is, I've always believed it's important to try with languages. This is completely at odds to how I was schooled on it, because then, when I was at school, it was basically a case of you're dyslexic, therefore you're bad enough in English, you can't do foreign languages. Which I found cruel, because I was actually better at Latin and getting the spelling correct than I wasn't in English at one point. Mainly because my Latin teacher let me hand print the letters, and whereas the rest of the teachers tried to make me write in cursive, and my dyslexia, which is a short-term memory dyslexia, coupled with dysgraphia, meant that my cursive writing turned into a line with occasional bumps and lumps and da-da-da-da, because my hand can't keep up my brain. It's got nowhere to store the stuff. I'm a computer with no RAM. And that's neither here nor there. That's the fun thing. It's all grouped under dyslexia. Everything's under dyslexia. It's fun times. But that means I'm going to apologize in advance for the Japanese language. And also, I want to emphasize, and I'll be talking about this straight away in the introduction, is that the Japanese were very early adopters of aviation. They were really in there early on, and they had their own ideas. And this is one of the problems I consistently come across, again, as I'll be discussing. So, thank you very much, and let's start the video. Well, there are two things which fit for this video today. One, I'm in the bomb site phase of packing up a house. We all know that phase. It's when you are slowly getting everything in the boxes, and it's the last bits, and there's pieces of paper everywhere. You're not sure where that paper came from. Case in point, I have no idea where that piece of paper came from. None at all. I've looked at it, read it through, no idea. It's just there at the moment. I will deal with it when it comes later. Sometime I must have hired it, but I don't know. And two, I am just about to hopefully be going off on a long trip. If everything goes to plan, on Friday of this week, I go flying. And I go to Oslo. Now that's this week recording. I'll be in, when this video comes out, I should be in Narvik. It's the 18th of June, I should be in Narvik. And that'll be fun. Why does it all fit with today's topic? Because today's topic is the Imperial Japanese Naval Aircraft Squadron System. And for some reason I scheduled this before I did the Imperial Japanese Naval Aviation Doctrine. And I think what probably went through my head was, well, it'll mean I'll have a video to point to where I can put all the terminology. And I can discuss all that while discussing their squadron system. And that is what I'm planning on doing, but I cannot really touch on a lot of their squadron system without also discussing quite a large chunk of their doctrine. In simple terms, this video is going to get you, if you are packing up a house, to the messy stage where you've almost finished packing up. It's going to get you there, and then the doctrine video is hopefully going to give you the final polish on the doctrine. And whilst each video is going to be standalone, it's going to be so much better if you watch both. It is going to be a lot better if you've watched both. Although I have the feeling I'm going to end up re-recording at least the Japanese Naval Aviation Doctrine one, probably from somewhere the other end of Europe. But we'll leave that to one side. Why am I doing this video? Well, I am working through everyone, so of course you're going to get to the Japanese at some point. But also because it's actually kind of important. You see, there is a cachet, and there is a phraseology, and I use it myself because it's an easy one to get away with and explain a lot, that the Japanese system of pilot training and pilot integration was overly perfectionist and didn't produce enough in the quantity. But the thing I haven't really done on this channel, and the thing a lot of people don't do, is get into the whys. This has led to some very strange opinions on the why. I honestly read the other day on the internet while I was doing research for these videos, and, well, while I was doing more research after I'd recorded the first drafts of these videos, that the whole problem for the Japanese in aviation doctrine is they're set up by the Semple mission. And the Semple mission basically creates Japanese aviation. Apart from being completely and utterly historically incorrect and factually incorrect, because Japanese naval aviation starts in 1912, prior to the First World War, and the Semple mission is not to the 1920s. Well, after the First World War, and all sorts of things are created in that time, it was also, to my mind, somehow incredibly Anglophobic. Because it was saying basically everything bad for the Japanese was copied of the British. And again, I don't think the person who actually wrote it had actually studied the British system of training as well. They are right, though, in one thing, in that the British training prior to World War I, and for that matter the American training and the Japanese training programs and systems, does look rather similar. They're all going about producing a very small elite of highly trained, highly capable pilots. Because if you consider aviation in the 1910s was all about a small elite cadre of highly trained pilots utilising a very small number of aircraft to do a very limited range of missions. That was literally aviation per se in any point prior to about 1915. That's it. That's the reality. And there is nothing wrong with that in that period. You have people like Izuke Yamamoto here. Not the Yamamoto you probably have heard of. Izuke Yamamoto writes in 1909 that the Japanese Navy is going to need an independent aviation force. It's going to need its own aviation capability. They start the Kaigen Kogujutse Kenyukai. Sorry again, Japanese pronunciations are still terrible. The amount I do it, you think I'd improve, but no, they still keep being terrible. I keep trying. The Commission on Naval Aeronautical Research starts up in 1912. And eventually, you have, once they've started up the Department of Naval Aviation, they get rid of that. But you also have the Yokosuka Kaigen Kokutai, the Yokosuka Naval Air Group, which is where they start off their training. And they set up their training academy. And all these things you have to think about in this period are about a small cadre. And what the Japanese really do is they develop a very finely honed cadre of aviators. And it starts off in this period. And I think the problem that we have in analysing Japan's aviation development and its air groups is we often miss this point. That they start prior to World War I. That they develop a lot of their systems based on their own understanding, their own interpretations of how to organise things. In many ways, aviation is the first area where they do not have a template of other people to copy because they're innovating at the same time as everybody else. And so they develop their own model. And yes, it is based heavily on Japanese culture and their approach to warfare and their approach to the lessons of war. But also, more importantly, and more critically, it is based on their needs of operation. And this is where you get your problem. Because I'll be discussing this as I go through, but basically, for those who just want to watch and hear the gut nugget and then go away, they don't want to hear the rest of the discussion, here's the point that's going to be made throughout this video and is going to be a constant theme. The Japanese developed their aviation. They use it in World War One at Tsingtao, or Qingdao, as it's more commonly called, as it's called today, incredibly successfully. It delivers everything they want. Everywhere they practice aviation, it delivers what they want. And then they build it up a bit more. They have some rigid airships, etc. And they develop it in the 1920s, and they had the Hosho. And then they have Akagi and Kaga. And so they have some really good ships, but that's it. And what happens when they start to bring in Soryu, Hiryu, the Shikakus? What happens is they are rapidly expanding that. They aren't developing a whole new doctrine. They aren't looking at, hang on, no, we need to re-engine this, we need to think about this, because we're going from what is basically a almost a bespoke service. What is pretty much a niche bespoke service to what is going to be a primary strike capability. And they realised aviation is going to be a primary strike capability. That's a core part of their doctrine. Aviation is going to be critical. This would include Isoroku Yamamoto, who... Okay, so there are multiple Yamamoto clans, and it's kind of like Henderson in the Royal Navy. There are going to be lots of them. You're going to find them turning up all over the place. Deal with it. It's also Lambert in terms of publications and people called Lambert. Some of them are related to each other. Some of them aren't. In this case, my understanding of the relationship between Ensuke and Isoroku... Isoroku, of course, is adopted into the Yamamoto family. He's adopted into a family which is from Satsuma. And Isseke Yamamoto's family are from Edo. But what it seems to be is that they have a common ancestor whose basic samurai sons split off and went and served different clans and set up their own sections, and it's, yeah. But they seem to be very much naval samurai in their history. They are very much samurai who like to serve the masters at sea. And you have to remember, the samurai... some of its translations can lead you down to the phrase servant, or servant for the Lord. And so... And that's me completely maligning it, but I don't want to get into the full complexity, because that could turn into a full, long video about the history of samurai, and how it applied to the seagoing forces of various lords in the Edo and other periods of Japan. That's a whole video in of itself, and if I'm going to do that video, I'm going to do that with Iron Brew, sitting there discussing it while sitting in the middle of Japan, with a proper background behind me, so I can discuss it. I am not going to do it in an office with a slide. It just needs that level of atmosphere. But anyway, there are lots of officers, a lot of them called Yamamoto, some of them related, who are working towards this aviation development. But their approach to aviation, the trouble is, it doesn't shift. They start off with, this is how we've grown aviation, this is how we've already achieved this level of excellence with aviation, this is going really, really well, we're doing really, really well, therefore why change it? And you see, this is where World War I experience comes into it. Because for the Japanese Navy, World War I, as I mentioned, goes really well. They do accomplish all they want to do. They carry out the first strikes with naval aircraft. They operate very successfully with the Wakamiya and its lovely Morris Farman seaplanes. I would not be flying in one of those. There is no way you could get me off the ground. I will look at them on the ground and I will admire them. I am not going up in anything which looks like that. No way. Nope. No circumstances. Not on your life. They are very brave. But there's the problem. You see, in World War One, Britain and France and Germany, although Lord help them, Germany doesn't learn from this and still has weird stuff going on in World War Two. But leave that to one side. That's due to a whole different Treaty of Versailles legacy thing and people's cultural memory. That's another video in itself as well, and one I will be getting to in a series. But a lot of the navies and air forces have the experience of, oh, frigate. Well, whilst it's lovely to be perfectionist and go, we want to get the top 1% of the top 1% as our pilots, the fact is we need rather a lot more than the top 1% of the 1%. Because they die in accidents, let alone combat. And because the top 1% of the 1% can be a lot better if they have wingmen. If they have other pilots up there on their wing going, we've got your back. Quantity has a quality all of its own. Having an actual quantity helps. But Japan doesn't have that experience because Tsingtao doesn't require more than 2 or 3 aircraft operating at any one time. They use like a dozen aircraft in active roles throughout World War One. They do it all at any one time. They have a lot more aircraft than that, but in terms of active roles, it's never a heavy load on their force structure. And then that's it. They've had glory. You see, if you come from a European or American background, you'll think about World War One as a terrible, horrific conflict where millions die in utter, muddy drudgery. But not if you're Japanese in the 20s and 30s. It was a glorious war. Everything you did went gloriously. You lost barely anyone, and you won great glory. Everything went well. It's the Battle of Tsushima, the Russo-Japanese War, then World War One. Good, not good. You're good at this modern war stuff, and look at how well your people do. And so at no point are they forced to look at their force generation and their structures and think, this might not work for a large war. And what's even better is they don't have that moment of reticence in the 1920s and 30s when they're planning. They don't. I'm going to be talking about this far more in the doctrine video, but at no point realistically in the discussion of their doctrine does anyone go for, perhaps we need to change our training system. There are a couple who suggest that they might need to allow more to become pilots. There are suggestions that maybe they should have a methodology for those who just fail, only, fail by a couple points, to come back and try again. There are some suggestions of various other solutions and options. There's all sorts of ideas put forward, but no one wants to just go in and go, right, yeah, we need to change this. We need to change this completely. And part of the reason there isn't is because of victory. They've got winner's disease. They won. Their structures worked well. Their structures, which worked well for a bespoke force, a small niche organization, worked well. And now they're scaling it up. So, I always do a shameless book plug in my videos. I do it for two reasons. One, thank you to everyone who likes, shares, and subscribes to the videos. That really helps the channel grow, and that means a lot to me, and it's really useful for me spreading love of naval history. And that's what I do this stuff for. That, and it funds my research. But I'm an academic. And believe it or not, YouTube doesn't give a pension, but universities do. However, in the UK, universities only give you a pension if they employ you, and they employ you based on how well your published books will do, basically, and your journal articles do. I can't do anything to really promote my journal articles because, believe it or not, they're behind mostly very expensive paywalls, and universities can't get access to them, etc. But, you know, there's nothing I can do with that. However, at the moment I have this book out, and so you can buy it, you can download the Kindle version, or I also see book versions. It's on its second edition, thanks to you, and I hope it gets to a third edition, because I'd like to add some more stuff into it. And there are more books coming soon. And I'm considering putting some articles up in a place where people can download them, because I like the idea of being able to show to a university, look, I'm published and people are wanting to read my stuff, so please employ me and give me pension. Because I'm fairly sure, as much as the UK politics keeps talking about triple lock, if you don't know, don't bother looking up, you don't want to get into it, on UK state pensions. I don't want to rely on a state pension as my income in my old age. I want to have some other investments and money. And, well, that means university work, or it means teaching in a college or schools, maybe. I don't know. I'll once we're moved, I'm going to have to do an actual proper sorting this all out. But thank you to everyone who's bought them, and thank you to everyone who's now buying copies, because that's how I show I'm a relevant academic. And well, as long as they don't take YouTube videos as proof of it, that's all my options are. Sadly enough, I keep hitting them over the head with the idea of YouTube videos, but they're not getting there. So, Kaigan Koko Humbo. This is the Imperial Japanese Naval Aviation Bureau, and they take over after the lovely people of the Kaigan Kogujutsu Kenkukai, the Commission of Naval Aeronautical Research, are wound down. So basically, they turned the commission into a bureau. Okay, nothing unusual there. They have training centers. They have all sorts of things they set up to create a Japanese naval aviation. And for quite a while, when you consider the size and scale of it, of its training branches especially, versus its actual aviation strength, it seems like it must have a basis for expansion. There's a small problem with that as a basic idea, though. Sadly enough, they managed to separate things up just enough that it gives them extra complication, and they managed to make training just difficult enough that it makes everyone's life very, very difficult. And they also have a focus in terms of flying and capabilities, which put emphasis on pilots being absolutely the best in everything. So the fun thing about all this specialization and focus is that for Japan, it produces something early on which breaks ground for everyone else. You see, in 1912, when they start off, they're looking for top graduates from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, and then they can go on for training for pilot school. Now, after a while, they're not getting A, enough of those top graduates applying, and B, that's not producing enough pilots. And so, January 1914, they make a decision, and by March 1914, they expand training to include non-commissioned officers. And by 1920, they've expanded it to include enlisted Navy personnel. Now, that's probably you're probably sitting there going, but Alex, you've just been saying that it was a small elite. Why, if they're expanding it so much to include everyone can come in and be a pilot, and everyone can do this, why, how can it be an elite? Well, they are expanding the pool they can draw from to get pilots, but they're not lowering the requirements for those pilots to be pilots. So they're instead of them taking 0.1, the top 0.1%, let's say, of personnel who qualify through from officer training school, they've added in NCOs who have been in service for years, and they added in people who've literally just joined the service as enlisted. If you can fly, if you can pass the written tests, if you can pass all the requirements, you can go for flight training. And the whole course takes roughly 9 months. And after they've gone through it, they're assigned to specific aircraft roles, either fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, land-based bombers, or seaplanes. And then they specialize. And for officers, by the time they get to a combat unit, they're usually lieutenant to junior grade. However, the NCO pilot training program took even longer. They were allowed to only go for their first solo flight after a month's operation with an instructor, whereas a piloting officer would be usually 12 to 13 hours. And the enlisted program, when they take you directly from Civvy Street to being a pilot, that program was 3 years long. Eventually they shortened it down, but yeah, 3 years long. And then, of course, there is the carrier operation training program. So, for that, prior to the Second Sino-Japanese War, you have to have done 500 hours or more of flight time before you could be assigned to carrier duty and before you could start going through the training. This is only relaxed in 1938. Only in 1938 is it relaxed. And all these programs, and I'm going to give you their names just because I'm cruel to myself. Now, the written tests and aptitude tests are called the Takesai Kensa. The pilot, the training programs, well, they have various names. The officers were called Hiko Kakusei, whereas the NCO enlisted trainees were called Hiko Renchusei. Renchusei. And there is a differential. Now, this actually feeds into their command structure and does allow them in some ways some capabilities to expand. It does allow them to draw from a wider pool. It does allow them to have personnel who literally will join the service just to be pilots. That is all they will do. They're not expected, not required to do anything else. Whereas an officer is going to get promoted off and is eventually going to become a senior officer, might go off to command ships and become an admiral and all these things. An NCO pilot or an enlisted pilot, once they're in the service, could be theoretically with you for 20, 30 years of service, just flying. They can become your very best pilots. But, oh, sugar, there's a small problem. You see, the Japanese set up the system so that the officers became the commanders of their units. And this is one of the reasons why they set up the system they do with the structure they do. So the officers are supposed to lead them. Now, this means that NCOs and enlisted don't really have much room for advancement within the squadron. Or within the unit. Which is far better to use than squadron because we're going to be getting into some fun in a second. they don't do eventually, especially during World War II, do end up sometimes taking command of whole units. Whole units end up falling onto the NCO cadre. And I would say, for especially the Japanese forces, the loss of the NCO cadre that took place during the first years of their involvement in World War II, that is the really big loss. Their officer pool is not massive. It never was going to be. There's too many tests. It's too many knockout stages for people trying to get an officer into the program. So it falls down on the NCOs. And yes, they take longer than the officers to qualify. But some of the NCO pilots you have taking part in Pearl Harbor, etc., they've been flying for the Japanese Naval Air Service for decades. That's a kind of experience you can't beat, but it's also a kind of experience you can't replicate. And the trouble is, those pilots are not being withdrawn. You see, they set up their whole training structures and programs to produce these people, but they don't pull enough of these people back into those programs to train the next generation. Everything's focused on delivering the creme de la creme force at the front. Not enough is focused on delivering the quantity until they're forced to. First by the Sino-Japanese War, where they have to expand things, and let's be honest, they expand things poorly at that point. They really do. They basically go, okay, we're adding some capabilities here. You know, what can we do? We'll create a air reserve student program, and if we're going to have them produce actual officers, we're going to make sure that, people need to know that they are they're reserve officers. So instead of them being called Shokoko, they're going to be called Yobi Shokoko. And, they are going to introduce things to differentiate people off. It becomes very, very structured very quickly, and the structures don't help. To give you an example, it would be like in the Royal Navy, if you were reservist, regular, you could tell by the wavy, different shape of the bands and different structures of the lines of their gold braid on their uniform. You can tell. But you're not called, Reserve Lieutenant. No, you are Lieutenant. You might be a reservist, but when you're on operations, you are a lieutenant. You are a flying officer. You are what you are. There can be unspoken things, but they're not spoken, because the moment you start speaking these things, you start creating barriers for interaction and barriers for information sharing and barriers for growth. They try, though. They really do try. So, why was I trying to avoid mentioning certain officer titles in the last slide, in the last discussion? Because they come in here. And this is a fun slide. So fun, I'm going to expand it to full screen. Now, I'm hoping you can see this and read through it with me. So, at the top you have the Koku Kantai, the air fleet. Now, that will contain one or more Koku Sentai. Now, for example, the good example of this would be the Dashai Koku Kantai, aka the Kido Butai, aka the 1st Air Fleet. Yeah, there is some interesting overlap at various points in this. In that, the Japanese, some of these units, the commanders will have the hat of being this, but also be in charge of the formation of carriers they're in charge of, and task force they're in charge of. So they take the dual hatting role very, very far in this period, and that can add even more fun, because one of the examples, I was reading a book which had staff complaining on one side to the other to the commander about staff on the other side, and you realise at a certain point that the commander in charge of them all is the same person, and the two staffs are acting like they're separate organisations and not actually working together. And this is within the Navy, okay? They are trying to pretend that there is a separate staff for the carrier formation and a separate staff for the air formation, and they are arguing about each other through their commander. And I was reading this in a beautiful piece which was translated by a friend of mine, which was sent to me to read through. And it's a book they're planning on coming out at some point in the next couple of years. And I sent back a note saying, I have seen this elsewhere in command structures. The British had it for about 20 minutes in the 1930s, when they had a rear admiral aircraft carriers, until he stamped it out hard. The first one did, and that was, of course, Admiral Henderson, because of the way the air service was structured. It didn't appear in the US structure at all. At no point did you have it in the US structure, because it's always part of the same service. How did the Japanese get that? Well, there's a reason for this. This is the administration. We're going to get into the operational organisation next slide. That's fun. And then, of course, you have the ships, which retain their traditional structure. And eventually they start getting their staff to work together and work properly together. But they do have an interesting time in the early period with it. And I think one of the reasons for this is because by making it as selective as they did to become part of the air service, you made it a big thing. And you made it a very important thing for the pilots. They felt it. They were part of the air service. They were something special. And they acted like it. It's the same problem you have with Royal Navy officers and dealing with destroyer crews. Destroyer crews, destroyer personnel believe themselves to be an elite in the Royal Navy. The tribal class destroyers believe themselves to be an elite of an elite. Managing those egos was a major mission of many admirals in the Royal Navy. And what they tended to do was just promote them. And that's one of the reasons why you end up with so many destroyer admirals running the Royal Navy in World War II. And so many destroyer admirals running all the navies in World War II. Leave that to one side, though. So, below that, you have the Kokei Sentai, which are the air floaters. Now, these consist of 2 Kokutai. And basically, they're the equivalent of a carrier division. They're 2 carriers. And is usually commanded by a rear admiral, who also commanded usually the carrier division. Land-based equivalents consisted of usually 3 Kokutais. Just to make things fun. But for me, it was quickly able to work out that basically what they decided was, okay, on land they can coordinate 3 air groups, but at sea our base operation is 2 carriers operating together, so it's going to be 2 air groups, and all this is basically going to be combined together, with the admiral basically being in charge of the carriers as well. Because otherwise you'd end up with 1 rear admiral in charge of the carriers in 1 carrier, and the rear admiral in charge of the air groups in the other carrier, because you're never going to get 2 rear admirals and their staffs on the same carrier. That would just lead to internecine war. And having 2 rear admiral each carrier under a rear admiral is just going to mean you're going to end up with 2 flag captains de facto. And that means there's going to be an argument over which group the carrier group should go. That doesn't happen. So the Japanese decide not to go down that route very quickly. So this is where you end up with that sort of double hatting going on. It's just more and more fun. And then we have the Kokutai. The air group, the equivalent to a wing, usually 18 to 27 aircraft. Now, if you're going to turn around and go, hang on, Alex, the carrier strength of the carriers, the air strength was a lot bigger than that. Yes, they were. They could be far larger, and were larger than that. But that's a theoretical figure which is banded around in a few books. So I've put it in there. The Kokutai were led by a commander, Shirei, and its air officer, Hikosho, where the latter typically had the role of executive officer. Now, here is the interesting thing. Hikotai comes below that, and that was commanded by a Hikotashio, and consisted of all the flight personnel of the Kokutai. Hikotashio were usually lieutenant commanders or senior lieutenants in rank. And then Butai is the smallest military unit of aviation personnel. It was commanded by a Buntashio, and was made up of the required number of personnel necessary to fly and maintain one shutai. Now, here's the thing. All those ranks discussed there are usually supposed to be officers. A shutai, as I'll be getting to in another slide, is basically the Japanese equivalent of a flight. It's free aircraft. And that's their lowest administrative terminology of aircraft. They're looking at it's free. Now, basically, when we're talking about Hikotai and Hitoshira, I have started treating that to an extent as the equivalent of squadrons. But it's interesting because you technically have these other officers above it, and they're the wings. So that's technically the carrier wing, the air group. But it's not the air group, because theoretically they can have more things added in. And also, the fact is, the Hikotai, basically, when they're talking about it, because the way the Kokutai brings together all the pilots, all the fitters, everyone together, the Hikotai is all the flying personnel. So it's commanded by a Hikotashio, usually lieutenant commander. And so usually you have a Hikotashio, who's a lieutenant commander, but you also have usually a Hikiyosho, who is a lieutenant commander, and a Shirei, who is usually a commander. And then all the flying personnel report to the Hikotashio, and below them, all the flying personnel are organized into buntai. But you'll notice that they say fly and maintain one shutai. All the personnel need to fly and maintain. Technically, at this level, there's also the administrative personnel, the people that are maintainers and fitters, also are included in that group. But they also have their own command structure going up within the team, which eventually reports to the Kokutai, the Shirei, a person in charge of the Kokutai. And theoretically it's 18 to 27 aircraft, but it grows dramatically, of course, because the carriers grow. But when it's first defined, it's defined around the Hosho. And life just gets more and more fun from there. This is why sometimes people will tell you the Hikotai is a squadron, equivalent to a squadron. Sometimes they'll tell you the Kokutai is equivalent to a squadron, but it's not. It's basically the wing air group on the carrier. And Hikotai really isn't a squadron because it's all the aviation personnel in a Kokutai. should belong to it. In theory. In theory, he says, because sometimes you get things, especially later in war, all sorts of things get mucked in around, and they are doing all sorts of things short term. And here is the organisation on an operation level when they launch from the carrier. The Hikokitai takes off. That's the air group you can launch. Now, they can organise in Detais, 18s, Shutai, 9, or Shotai, 3. And Shutai is, I said, 9 aircraft. It's their equivalent of flight. So 6 aircraft in the Fleet Air Arm with the Royal Navy, especially under the Royal Air Force Air Ministry control, but carried on usually multiples of 6 to go up. The Americans play around, but the Japanese, it's roughly 9. So again, we could describe the Shukaku class's air group as 1 datai of zeros, 18, 3 shutai of vowels, 27 aircraft, and 3 shutai of kates. The Nakajima B5N torpedo bombs. Because she carries 18 zeros, 27 vowels, and 27 kates. But the Shutai is not a squadron. You cannot consider it the same to a squadron. It's where everything's formed in, but it's not a squadron. It's not a squadron. I have to emphasize that. Neither, therefore, is a buntai, because it's the smallest administrator, but they never would expect to deploy as a single buntai. And then you have more fun in that you can have senior buntai commanders, and you can have sometimes you can have multiple lieutenant commanders in the Hikotashia, and sometimes they group it together. So sometimes, you know, again, once you have that figure of usually 18 to 27 aircraft of Kokutai for air group, well, then people go, well, that must be their squadron, because look, they're putting in 18 and 27 aircraft. And you could be right, you can put that point together. But a carrier is not carrying 3 different air groups. 3 Shires, 3 Hikoshios, 3 Hikotashios, and then, well, if we consider just how many there are, you'd be carrying 8 Bundashiros. You're going to be carrying 8 Bundashiros, whatever happens. But what they have is they usually have aboard 1 Shire, 1 Hikoshio. They can occasionally have multiple Hikotashios. They don't normally have. They normally have 1 officer with that role and rank aboard a carrier. But there have been examples I've read about where there have been multiple officers addressed by that description aboard a carrier. Usually that has been the scenario when they have been fusing air groups together to rapidly create an air group. It's a later war scenario. So what you could treat it as is you have a commander air group, a air officer who is the executive officer of the air group, and then you have a senior flying officer, senior pilot, lead pilot of your air group. And almost what happens is each one of those takes a group of aircraft and almost acts as a squadron commander, if you're sort of considering a squadron. And they will have the Buntashiros with their 9 aircraft, their Shutai, below them. And each buntai may have a couple of officers in it, but maybe mostly NCOs and enlisted pilots. So that's roughly the structure we're talking about. Roughly. And it works, but it's also not a system which is going to have a lot of redundancy. Not a system which is going to produce a lot of redundancy in your command structure. Not a system which is going to allow you to rapidly evolve your command structure or split your command structure up. If you consider the Royal Navy very quickly in World War II, at certain points, goes through a process of splitting squadrons, where they literally take the commanders off one way, the executive officers off the other way, split up the flight commanders, split up all the officers, and so set them off, and then put new trainees to fill up those two groups now to full strong squadron strength. They do that to grow their force. It's very difficult with this structure to do that sort of operation. It's very difficult to do that in this sort of formation. And you also have the Shotai with 3 aircraft below, which is sort of the operational. Now, as I mentioned a few times, I should be off, and this happens in Narvik when this comes out. And that is Scandinavia 24, the Scandi Ship 2024. And we are crowdfunding for this because it's myself, it's Drakenfell, it's Garius the Brit, it's Dr. Dan, and it's who we're calling Boom Boom Dan, by popular demand, the chemist, to come with us, because we hope to do all sorts of fun things. This is going to be an interesting trip. It's going to hopefully have a lot of naval history in it, and a lot of stuff covered, and yeah, there's a link down below if you're interested in supporting us. It really does help us to get these things done, because these sort of trips are where we take a month and we pretty much go around a whole slew of museums, because these are museums which often we couldn't justify the cost to visit on their own. So if we can take an entire month and go and visit them all together, we can justify it. Especially with your support, then we don't have to worry about how much money the videos make or how much money we get in from the videos or those things to pay for it. It's paid for by you in advance, and that means it. And as such, there's lots of special bonuses in there. There's lots of videos from all of us that are edited as things go, lots of stuff we do, challenge coins, all sorts of fun things. And it's kind of like we did Australia last year and Canada the year before that. It's us going and being naval history geeks wherever we can. And next year, of course, we're hoping to do Japan. And now we're into the squadron operational development. Now, reconnaissance is a major part of Japanese naval aviation doctrine, Japanese fleet doctrine. It always was. And it's a major part of naval aviation from the beginning, from Izuki Yamamoto's paper in 1909 onwards. Reconnaissance is up there. So it's unsurprising that by 1942, when you're looking at unit identification numbers, if you're looking for a reconnaissance aircraft, well, just look at the squadron designations, and the ones that start off with 1, they're going to be reconnaissance aircraft. If you are looking for aircraft that are afloat reconnaissance aircraft, operating, i.e. from those cruisers, etc., that have those aircraft, etc., you are looking for a 4. These are quite early numbers in the categorizations, and that's because they're quite important numbers. This was something the Japanese were focusing in on. One of the interesting things you have to think about is the fighters, well, they start off in 2s. T-42 they're in a 2, but this is in many ways the designation after some experience of combat during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Again, one of the interesting things that happens there is you have a development of fighter technology and of interest in fighters. Again, something that we talked about in Naval Aviation Doctrine video when it happens. Now, as we go down, you've got the carriers in terms of their dive bomber groups, and their torpedo bomber groups are 5s or 500s. The submarine launch float plane groups and carrier groups for float planes are 600s. Land-based bomber groups 700s. The flying boat groups 800s. The maritime patrol aircraft, maritime escort are 900s. Now, these are all listed through. And you also will have within the groups capabilities. You'll have it explained whether they come from the Yokosuka Naval District, the Kyoto Naval District, the Sasebo Naval District, and Maizuru Naval District. And again, these are grouped. So fighter group interceptor fighters and float reconnaissance aircraft come from Kyoto. So if you see a unit start with 3-3 or 3-4, or 4-3 or 4-4, they come from Kyoto Naval District. And they are a fighter group or a float reconnaissance group. However, they could be, let's see, a 1 and 3. So they could be a reconnaissance aircraft group that comes from Kyoto. And if they then have an odd digit on the end, so they're 131, they're a standing air group. They are permanently stood up. If they're 132, though, they are a special air group. They are set up when they're needed to. If this is mildly confusing you, because you're thinking, well, hang on, no, don't you just have squadrons? Don't worry. What the Japanese have done is developed a system whereby, if you know it and you live it, the moment you hear a squadron's number, you will know everything you need to about the squadron. You will know what it does. You will know where it's from. And you'll know whether it's a permanent group or a temporary group for an operation. You will know all of that from its numbers, from its group identification. But it still gets interesting, because usually when you hear organizations, what they are talking about and the numbers they're giving you are for kokutais, which makes them sound like, well, hang on, Alex, if that's the case, then surely a kokutai is a squadron. I can agree with you. Under that circumstance, you would expect it to be a squadron. But it's supposedly not a squadron. It's not a squadron because it's what they are the equivalent to sort of a wing in structure and multiple squadrons beneath them. But they will then have the numbers. But there again, the kokutai will then have units within it which are divided up, and it just makes life fun. It really does. Whereas land-based kokutai are often focused in on certain roles, the carrier-based kokutai is, of course, a mixture. And I think that's, again, one of the scenarios you just have to accept. And they can often also get named after the carrier. So if they take off, if a Hikokitai takes off from Shikako, they're known as the Shikako Hikokitai. And that's what they're called. They are... So, to an extent, a kokutai and a group aboard a carrier is different than a group on land. They're given the same name and same theoretical designation and organization, but it's very different. Because the ones on land, they will be religiously standardized and organized. The ones at sea are organized as a carrier air group. Again, this kind of fits with a lot of the scenarios you see in most air forces, etc. If you're talking about a bombing wing, they usually have all the aircraft of one type. Whereas the carrier air wing will have a mixture of aircraft. It all makes sense. Then we have torpedo bombers. Now, the Dai Iko Koku Sentai, aka the Iko Sen, the 1st Carrier Division. They're the core unit that really are the foundation of the Japanese naval aviation experience. They are what provide the lessons and the learning and the development for Japanese naval aviation in the 30s when they come into service. And Akagi and Kaga and Destroyer Squadron 7 under command of Vice Admiral Shushi Nakamura in April in 1941 do quite a lot of duties. But you have to think about that. Hang on, what's he in charge of at that point? Is he in charge of the 1st Carrier Division? Is he in charge of, and this is the fun thing, the first Koku Sentai? Or is he in charge of the Koku Kantai? Or is he in charge of all 3 at the same time? What do you think? And so, this is the Japanese structure. They have the position, they have a nice structure, and then they go, well, yes, but then we're going to simplify things. And someone's just going to wear many hats. Because otherwise you end up with a lot of extra admirals wandering around. And the Japanese do have a very admiral-heavy command structure. They do have a lot more senior officers, a lot more focus on seniority than the British and the American navies do at various points. But they're also not silly in how they use them. And on top of that, they have aircraft identification. And so if you're looking at an aircraft, it could have its squadron number, or rather its unit number, Kokutai number, and then it would have its letters and types. And these can be various things as well. Now, if we consider the Nakajima B5N, well, it's a carrier attack bomber, so it's B. Okay. Makes sense. Then it's their 5th one, or 5th design for it, for that role. So it's their B5. And then it's made by Nakajima, so you add on an N. Nakajima Hikokai. And, again, this is fairly standard. Most nations do something like this to designate their aircraft. But it comes through. It's part of their structuring. It's part of their thinking things through. And, yeah, it matters what they're giving aircraft, what details they're giving them, what they're deciding they should have. I do love the fact that because they have both Hero and Hawker aircraft, which are interesting, and you have flying boats are given H, they then decide that to differentiate if they go on Heinkel aircraft, especially for testing, they call it HE. And there's also special purpose aircraft get MX. And because they've already got Seisbo, they need SI for Showa Hikoki. It's great having a system. It's terrible when that system kind of has to deal with reality and have to have things added in. Now, dive bombers are another area where the Japanese really do fall in love. But again, this is one of the reasons why they have the structure they have. For both torpedo bombers and dive bombers, they realize that you need multiples of 3. That's how they operate best. If you have the 3 come in, you can bracket your opponent. That's your minimum. So this is why you have, as if by magic it's here. I could have made you watch me clicking through all the slides back to it, but let's forward through. And this is where you get into the interesting things, because these are the operational organizations of Shotai, Chutai, which is, of course, works with that lower division of the Buntai, which therefore theoretically could be your closest equivalent of a squadron, because the Shotai is the flight. But it's not. how we approach the squadrons, because it's run by a lieutenant. And the reason it's run by a lieutenant is because most of their pilots are NCOs and enlisted at this point, because again they're pilot selection, so they haven't got enough officers, and therefore they have it run by a lieutenant, but they're not having the squadron run by a lieutenant because they're far too junior to run a squadron. It's the Japanese get themselves into a lot of fun with that system, and they are developing something which is very much Japanese and Japanese approach. And this is one of the problems we have, because when you come at from a Western scenario, and I found this myself when I first tried to reason this, and if I start thinking of it and try to think of things as equivalents to squadrons or wings or this sort of organization, I get it wrong. Because really, the Kokutai is where you have the administration and everything, and it's really what you're talking about is, this is the air organization. This is where we've combined everything for it to work. At this point, we have the senior officers, the senior NCOs, we have everything tying in together to work. And that can be as a larger strike group of land-based fighters or land-based bombers. It can be as a carrier air group. But what it is not is really a wing as wing commanders we would understand, because it also fulfills some of the functions of a squadron command. Because below that, you don't really have the levels of squadron command as you or I would probably think about them in terms of reference to a Western squadron. Because you have all the pilots organized, yes, and led in the Hikotai, by the Hikashiro. But you have the Shutais, led by, organized below that, into the Buntai, which are led by a Buntashio. And often the Buntashio is the leading pilot of that Shutai. And then you have the Shotai below that, and the Shotai will often be made up either entirely of NCO pilots, or will have an NCO and some enlisted pilots, and that's how they run things. It's a very different structure. And so that means you have a Shutai almost takes on some of the squadron duties, but that's also far too junior officer for the British equivalent, because the British equivalent of running a squadron, which would be 12 aircraft, or sometimes more, but usually roughly 12 aircraft, is going to be a lieutenant commander, maybe even a full commander, depending on variations, and then there's going to be a commander in charge of the air group, with a lieutenant commander as the deputy command. The Hikotai itself, the Hikoshiro, could be a senior lieutenant. They can be a lieutenant commander, they can be a senior lieutenant. This is all a very different structure than that which we are used to. And when we try and put our squadron structure, onto the Japanese, that's when the confusion starts. You have to treat it as its own structure, and you have to treat it as something which came about because of how the Japanese were approaching their operations. They start off with a very small officer-led organization, and then instead of expanding the pool of officers who could be allowed in, they keep that officer pool small and expand to allow NCOs in as pilots. And then when they need to expand it further, instead of again reducing the requirements for the NCOs or the officers to get in, and no, they expand it so it's direct entry as enlisted pilots able to come in. And also the reserves organizations. But they keep the selection criteria, the quality criteria, and the time of training and the ability to fail from that training the same. So they are trying to keep standards of flying incredibly high whilst expanding the pool they can go from. And they are basically building out a force structure around their officers and then around their NCOs as they have to. So in many ways, you could say the original squadron structure would have been what you can see in the officers of a Kokutai. But then instead of having that become a squadron, that became a larger air group with the addition of the NCOs and forming it round, and then the enlisted forming around them. They've expanded and grown it out. And that's also what causes some of the fun, because some of the discussions and terminology you see, these things change as time goes on, as the Japanese expand the force. And nowhere can that be seen better than in the evolution of the units. In fact, they go through whole changes. They are developing as they go, and they are developing as they go from their own starting point. That's the beauty of naval aviation when it started as it did. So many nations who jumped into it at that point were starting from their own. And what they've done is sometimes they've added in information from others and other sources, but they've often kept their own structures going. In many ways, you can say the British and the Americans build the structures which are closest to each other, and even they are very different. To the extent that some people like to write ideas about, oh, well, the British structure improved when it got closer to the American structure. And others write, the American structure improved when it got closer to the British structure. And then you look at those structures, and yes, they're evolving through experience. They are evolving. But again, the differences remain. In fact, you could argue that even within the NATO standardization that has supposedly gone on through through the forces which are members of NATO, if you actually look at the structures of squadrons and how formations are formed and how they're raised and how they are organized, there is often variation. There are often, oh yes, this role is equivalent to that role. It's equivalent because it covers the same areas, but it covers it from a completely different angle, and it has a very different position within the overall command structure. Because again, aviation is one of those areas where everyone has developed themselves and has found what works for them and what works within their methodology of operation, within their doctrine, within their geostrategic situation. And the question for the Japanese, of course, is whether this worked for them. I would argue, and this is going to be more of a discussion in the doctrine realistically than it is in this scenario, this video, that the Japanese are building a system which works for them in a scenario where they can control the levels of escalation. And this is a problem. They managed to control the levels of escalation in the Russo-Japanese War. They shouldn't have been able to. On paper, they shouldn't have been able to. They were able to do so. They were able to control the levels of escalation in World War I because it was very easy for them to choose how much and to what extent they get involved in the war. And again, the Sino-Japanese War. They're able to control levels of escalation because they're the only ones who are able to escalate. The Chinese are in no position to escalate the conflict. They really aren't. And this means they can follow this route of widening the pool but not re-examining the standards and the system that they're holding these pilots to, the standards they're holding these pilots to, works. If you don't control the level of escalation, if you find yourself fighting in a scenario where you are not able to control what's happening, you're not able to predict the level, you have to just start having the availability to manage whatever comes your way, to deal with whatever comes your way, that's when you have to start going, well, do we really need to limit our pilots to the top 0.1%, or could we limit it to, I don't know, the top 5%? Which is probably going to get us a lot more pilots. It probably is going to provide you a lot more pilots. That's the reality. And by 1944, when they are going through this process, they changed the unit identifications again. And by this point, They have carrier fighters, the Kosen, their squadrons 1 to 400. The Odsen, the interceptor fighters, 401 to 800. And the night fighter, the Heisen. They have 3 types. And they're all known as the Sento Hikotai. Think about that. Sento Hikotai. So at this point, they're all drawn into their air groups. They've gone with that phraseology. And this is again where that comes through. And so at a certain point, some people have started to say, well, Hikotai at this point becomes squadron. It does to an extent, but it didn't mean it earlier. To an extent, by this point, we are talking about Hikotais as squadrons, and they are unit designations. But they are also still usually organized in Kokutai, which take over all the administration and support details of them. Just to add life, to make life confusing. And this is again why I say you have multiple Hikotai later on in the war. But you don't at the beginning of the war. Just to make life joyous and fun. And then you have your attack squadrons, the Kogeki Hikotai. Dive bombers 1 to 200. Attack bombers 201 to 400. Land-based bombers 401 to 600. Land-based attack bombers 601 to 800. And these are now the squadron numbers. So the squadron numbers now no longer differentiate types, the name of the squadron, whether it's identified as a Sento Hikotai, or a Kogeki Hikotai, or a Teisatsu Hikotai, or a Tenshin Hikotai, differentiates the type. That's a big change. That's a big change from the previous set. It's also a change that can bring about confusion, but to me it really illustrates the changing from the basis of your organization and leadership, from your Kokutai, your air groups, down to something which would reflect a squadron organization, and a broadening of your organization for that. So this was the 1942 organization structure. And this is it by 1944. There is still some differentiation. You can tell by their numbers what type of squadron they are, and then you can tell whether they're a carrier squadron. If they're a Kogeki Hikotai and they're 223, you know they're a carrier attack bomber squadron. You're still getting information from that. You're still getting information from it. It's not what the information used to be, it's a different form. Which brings us all to the next point and the last slide for today's discussion. Notice there's no summary slide. That's because, again, you really can't do a summary if you don't have the doctrine. And you can't really do the doctrine if you haven't covered all this background first. And hence the 2 videos, and hence the emphasis of this video. So there is a rather interesting bit of history, and this comes from multiple sources, and I have a friend who I've already referenced a couple of times. I'm going to say thank you, Daisy. I'm not using their real name. They've asked me not to discuss them on YouTube because they are at a very traditional university, and that university does not like YouTube. They do not like history being done on YouTube. They're not a British university. But they're really, really good at this. And they sent me a lot of translated documents, and including this section comes from them. But it isn't in quote marks because they don't want me to attribute it to them. But I feel I don't want to not attribute it to someone else. So this section has been translated from multiple documents and put together for me by them, but I'm not allowed to say their name. Sorry. I am saying thank you, Daisy. And they will say this book, this work comes from things published by by the Zero Fighter Pilots Association. I think it's thus did the Zero Fighter Fort. It was published in Japan, I think, by Bunshin Nesco in 2004, and Yoshio Ikari's works on the Hawk Marches in 2000 and the Naval Air Technical Arsenal and things by Shiramori, etc. There are lots of very, very good works published about the Japanese fighters. One of the things I do love is the fact that you often focus on the Zeros, but actually it was the A5M which really saved fighters, because guess what? If it hadn't been for the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Japanese naval experience there was a good chance the Japanese by 1941-42 wouldn't have had fighters in service. Fighters were not doing well. You see, prior to radar, and I'm going to again give you the discussion they sent me, especially the speed but overall performance of strike aircraft, improved, it was becoming more difficult for fighter planes to engage attacking aircraft, resulting in fewer opportunities to fire. At the time, Japanese doctrine, at least in the way it was expressed, considered it difficult for fighter planes to achieve successful intercept unless they had a speed difference of more than 30 knots in their favour. Furthermore, firing at a high-speed aircraft is almost always in the form of a tracking shot. You fire a burst in the vicinity and hope something hits. The trouble was, even if a 7.7mm machine gun hit a metal aircraft, the shot may well only ricochet unless the correct angle is achieved. The fighter planes of the early 1930s had a short range and were unable to accompany or provide cover for the carrier's attack aircraft, and not able to properly provide a combat air patrol either. Finally, alongside the already mentioned improvement in the performance and firepower of bombers between 1953 and 1935, there had also been an expansion in the defensive firepower of formations, making fighter aircraft relatively less effective, it was felt, overall. Now, the thing is, that can be written by almost any navy. There is the USN going through the same problems, there is the Royal Navy going through the same problems. Everyone has the same problems and how they approach it. I have to say the Japanese were once again the most radical. They were actually thinking about getting rid of fighters. And think about that. And that's today's question, by the way, is imagine World War II, where the Japanese have got rid of fighters for their carriers. They have no Zeros involved or A5Ms involved in Pearl Harbor or any of those battles. Midway, Coral Sea, no fighters. All strike aircraft. All strike aircraft. There's both some interesting prospects there and some particularly problematic prospects, especially as if this happened in the early 1930s. Other nations might take note. Now, the Royal Navy I can't see going for it because they're looking at fighting their way through the Mediterranean, and their response and fighting their way through the Mediterranean, South China Sea, all these areas where they expect to have to deal with land-based aircraft. And yeah, fighters are part of doctrine, but the difference is that the Japanese have fighters intercepting, and their doctrine includes taking out the enemy. Their doctrine has involved in a fighting superiority, wearing them down. Remember, a lot of their doctrine, a lot of their thought process is about attrition of superior enemies. So you need to be killing their aircraft and killing their aircrew as well if you shoot them down. But for the British, the doctrine is on breaking up enemy air formations. The American doctrine is about halfway through those ideas. In between. So it's a really interesting thing what could have happened. And how does this affect squadrons? Well, I think this is possibly why you end up with the difference in air groups. Where instead of having, let's say, 27, 27, 27, or carriers designed around that, you have 18, 27, 27. because, of course referencing the Shikakus, because the fighters, they were for a while really on the edge. And it's the second Sino-Japanese war and the performance of the A5M and other fighters in that war which shows, hang on, they're still useful, they're still doing good stuff. And that's what drives the development of the Zero, the A6M. But why does this come back to their structures? I think the other problem you have for the Japanese, and I do really feel this with the Kokutai, is that the officers are moving up. And for them, especially in the carrier groups, the specialism is where they are for a few years, but then they're moving up. And so the people who really understand how their fighters work, the people who really understand how their attack aircraft work, the people who basically specialize all their lives in them, the NCO and enlisted pilots, they're left behind. And whilst good officers will go and listen and take on board their opinions, for every good officer who listens, there's always an officer who doesn't. And there's a half a dozen on the range in between who might listen in various levels of selectiveness. And I think, to my own mind, that's an interesting after scenario of all this. That the Japanese both succeeded in building up some truly amazing experts in aviation. They truly did. And at the same time, built a structure which ignored the vast majority of them. As I said, today's question is, imagine World War II without any Japanese fighters in the beginning phase of it. I can't imagine they'd not develop a fighter some point before 1944. They certainly have the aviation industry to do so. But, yeah, imagine 1941, 1942, no Japanese fighters. And their carrier air groups. What's even more interesting is if the Japanese Army goes the same way. The Imperial Japanese Navy was looking at this, so was the Imperial Japanese Army, and that could have been really interesting. They have less support in the IJA than the IJN. The IJN, it's a very real possibility. The IJA, it's a hotly contested topic. So, people are possibly getting killed for their views on it. But we'll leave that to one side. That's a byproduct of Japanese political debate at this point, in this time. So, with that said, what have we got coming up next week? The conception, operation, and conclusion of HMS Unicorn. Then we have War Emergency Ships, and then we have the Bogue, Ruler, and Attack Class. Then we have 801 Squadron, Royal Navy. Hopefully by then, I will be moved in to my new place. And who knows, I might have re-recorded that in my new place. Because I can, whilst I theoretically have these all recorded, the fact that if anyone thinks they're going to survive the entirety of the next few weeks without being re-recorded at least once or twice whilst I'm in hotel rooms, I love your faith in me if you believe that. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you liked the video, please do like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't like the video, I'm sorry. I tried my best. And I'll try to keep doing better. I have to say, with the Japanese pronunciation, it's onions. It's layers of onions. And the more and more you go through, the more and more you find out, and the more and more it gets added extra on. And I started this process a long time ago in my PhD thesis. And one of the things I will always say is, the moment you stop learning is the moment you just stop trying to teach. I am still learning more every single day. And I will go back to videos and I will change them someday. I will record new versions of them because I'll have learnt more. But I hope you found this an interesting introduction to the Japanese aircraft formation and organisation in the interwar years and World War II. It's a taster, it's an introduction, and there is a doctrine video coming, and they are two parts of a whole. And there is a whole slew of videos on their aircraft carriers which are also part of building up on that. Because honestly, we can learn more. As I mentioned at the beginning, there is a thing called winner's disease, where because you won something, you presumed you got everything right. The Japanese had that, and that affected a lot of their decisions and how they grew their organization. Because it works so well, let's keep on doing that and just grow on that. Sometimes you have to be as critical of victories as you are of defeats. You have to look at what went right, what went wrong, and why it went right and why it went wrong in both. Because both are equal opportunities to learn from, and both you should learn from. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you like the videos, please do like, share, and subscribe, and take care, and hope to see you on another video soon.